Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about the unity and the singular purpose of the universal church. But as we look out into the world, we see something different. We see churches in denominations that at least nominally have separated from each other. So to look kind of at this disparity between the oneness that we looked at and this idea of denomination, let's first take a look at some history. So for the first 1,000 years of roughly from the crucifixion until around, we'll kind of narrow this down a little bit more, but around 1000 AD, there's no real centralized church. Really what there is each individual church or a group of smaller churches has what's called a bishop. Now, a bishop, what they call a bishop, is the same thing as we call a pastor or an elder. So in Scripture, Timothy and Titus, there's basically two offices, and we'll talk more about these later, but one of them is deacon and the other one is pastor, and that same thing that means pastor is also bishop, shepherd, and elder. And so all of those titles are one and the same. So when I say bishop, basically I just mean the pastor or the leader of the church. So all of these bishops lead their kind of individual churches, and they would have what was called councils, and you might have heard of the Nicene Council that we get the Nicene Creed from in 325, I think, and there was a number of other councils throughout the years that occurred that were basically they would go and they would argue positions on different theological and biblical topics and trying to figure out what was the correct interpretation of Scripture. So, but what happened was, especially towards the end of the first millennia, the bishops of Rome, Antioch, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and Alexandria rose to prominence. Now, these are most of these are key places. Well, actually, all of them are key places, and they're large places too, where they have a large church and they have the center of power. So they started to rise in prominence compared to all of the other bishops that were throughout the Roman world at the time. And so then, kind of ending this first period in 962. Now, it might not be the exact date, but in 962 is when the Holy Roman Empire begins. And there's a little bit of contention, but at least in my opinion, based on what I've read, it really marks the beginning of the Catholic Church. And obviously the Catholics say that they began much earlier, that they think that, Peter was the first pope, but none of the Catholic identity or anything was there for the first basically 1,000 years. And so 962, when the Holy Roman Empire comes around from the fall of everything that's going on in Europe, the Catholic Church begins to actually identify and take root as what the Catholic Church is, and kind of gets intermingled in the power structure of the Holy Roman Empire. And meanwhile, the bishops of Rome and Constantinople are now kind of the main two bishops in power. So the Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem have all kind of fallen. Jerusalem is obviously there where there's a lot of contention in the Middle East, and so the Muslims kind of take over in Antioch, and Alexandria falls too. And so Rome, you have two main central structures of power in what is starting to become the Catholic Church. And then the next key date is 1054. And I would say this is actually the date when the Roman Catholic Church solidified, especially like in the West, as really what it is, because it's when the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church split. And so the Catholic Church, with its head of being the bishop in Rome, is now solidified in itself, and the Eastern Orthodox splits with its head being in Constantinople. And so now this is the first time where the church, the Catholic Church, really only had one leader. And so it really, solidified that identity of being under that bishop and the Eastern Orthodox. Now I'm not 100%. I know I've studied this before, but I couldn't exactly tell you right now. And I didn't look into it too much because it's not what I really wanted to talk about today. But there were, of course, key differences between, that the Eastern Orthodox were like, we're going to split over these things. And it was a mutual split. They both wanted to split from each other. It wasn't like a one splitting from the other, but they both split. So really, 1054 is really when the Roman Catholic Church kind of became somewhat, of what it is today. And so now we're talking about splitting away from the Catholic Church. Well, that kind of brings us to the Protestant Reformation. Now, one of the things that I kind of want to make clear in this is that, you might have thought, one, that the Catholic Church began much earlier. Now, you might not have thought, well, it began in 33 AD, but you might have thought it began at least by the 3rd century or something. But it really didn't begin until, the first millennia, about, either 962, 1054, somewhere in there. But another thing that, on kind of the other side, is that we often think that the Protestant Reformation started, when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in the 16th century, but it actually began about 300 years before that, in the 14th century. And it probably even started on a more local level before that, but the first actual, public questioning of the Catholic Church started about 300 years after the Catholic Church actually became what it was. And so this guy named Wycliffe, right? And you might have heard the name before, John Wycliffe, or Wycliffe Publishers. And there's, he was one of the first people to actually translate the Bible into English. And from him, another one of the very early reformers in the 14th century was John Huss, who found Wycliffe's writings, and he took them back to where he lived. He took them from England, where Wycliffe was, and he took them to Czech. The name of it was Bohemia at the time, which is now Czech. And so it began to spread more and more publicly. And John Huss was burned at the stake in 1415, I believe. And so when we think about the Protestant Reformation, we kind of think, like I said, 15th century, but it really started in, the 1370s with John Wycliffe, and then, 45 years later with John Huss being killed because of him publicly questioning the Catholic Church. So there's only 300 years, like I said, 300 years between the Catholic Church having that kind of stronghold of power and the people publicly questioning it, even dying for questioning the beliefs of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church, what I really want you to be clear is that they don't have any stronghold or of knowledge. They make that claim, but really before the first millennia wasn't the Catholic Church. That was certainly Christians, but it was a more general, not really a centralized church, definitely not the Catholic Church. And so as we look at kind of this idea of denominations, we kind of get that understanding of, like, even though Protestantism is a more recent thing, Catholicism didn't really have that much time of being in power, and they don't have the grip of biblical knowledge at all that they claim to have. But also I wanted to there's a common saying that says we stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's definitely true when it comes to the Protestant Reformation, with the people that we know of, like Luther and Calvin. They took from the hundreds of years before of men who publicly went against the Catholic Church. And even since then, we've continued to build upon what they've done and their knowledge of Scripture, and continued to understand it in light of what they've done. And like I said too, that many of these people were killed because they questioned, the powers that were in place at the time. Now let's bring this to modern day. Because with the Protestant Reformation, it brought in a lot of individual studying the Scripture, right? The Protestant Reformation brought about Bibles in languages that were actually understood by the common people. So before this, it was just Latin. And if you didn't know Latin, if you weren't one of the, if you weren't in the Catholic Church, essentially, you couldn't read the Bible for yourself. But now this brought about the Bible in the language of the people, where everyone can look at it and interpret it for themselves. And so what seems to be we have this one thing that's right, going to all of these different ideas and different denominations, isn't necessarily as bad as it seems, because it actually comes from people getting into the Bible themselves, interpreting it, whether rightly or wrongly, but actually being able to interpret the Bible for themselves so that they could have these differences of opinion and, argue back and forth. And then when the differences were large enough, they would create different denominations, and they would have slightly different beliefs. So next week, we'll kind of get more into denominations. So I'll see you next week as we look at denominations.